about Keystone. So the idea is, what we're trying to do with Keystone is provide you one place where you can have your users authenticate and then go talk to all these services. One thing we wanted to do is it had to be web friendly, had to be RESTful. There were not a lot of standards out there at the time. When Rackspace put out our auth, we kind of invented the API and we put it out there. There's a lot of tools that already use it, more so for Swift, where you have a lot of tools that are kind of like mount a file system and things like that. They're pretty complex tools that use that. But there's some things like the Fog library, libcloud. They're all using our auth 1.0 API. So we wanted to go kind of put that out there, open source. We didn't want to put our Java code out there. Java was a no-no. I think it kind of still is for a core OpenStack project. So we re-implemented Keystone. But the idea is we want a system that will just do authentication initially. Just keep it simple. Take what is being done in Swift with Swath and in Nova with the LDAP, the auth module, and just re-implement that in a separate module that allows that API interaction with clients. And so we try to really contain the problem to authentication as much as possible, which is kind of proving who you are to the system. Of course, there's a little bit of authorization that sneaks in. It's hard to do, and we'll talk a little bit about where authorization was, which is, once we know who you are, what can you do? Right? So the idea of authentication is it's like a badge, right? When you walk into the front desk, you prove who you are, you show your license, you provide your credentials, you get a badge, and you walk around with the badge, and you scan out one room, you go in, you scan out another room, you don't go in, right? So that's what we're trying to do with authentication. To constrain the problem, we're also very focused on...
Real quick question?
Yeah.
What about the third A, AAA? Do you do any accounting or try to?
No, not in Keystone. Well, we did put a blueprint out there, multi-tenant accounting, which introduced the concept of a tenant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the idea was that every operator are going to have their different ways of billing and chargeback and accounting. And if we try to build that into OpenStack, it's just going to be a big tangle. It's SAP basically in Python. We weren't interested in doing that. So what we did is, okay, we said let's find a way to just kind of collect a bunch of resources in one way and report out the usage. And then we'll let everybody do the mapping and the mediation, and all the operators do that on their end. So that's where the idea of tenant came in. It's to touch on that third A as well. So the one thing that is often confusing about Keystone is I look at it as three pieces. There's the API. Right, that's a REST API. It's defined in documentation, in model, in XSD. We have samples for the JSON. It's been out there for a while. And then there's an implementation. So we took that API, which supports a broad set of use cases, and we developed the Python reference implementation. The Python reference implementation, for example, the one in Keystone, supports one tenant, one user. Right, so you log in, like one token, one tenant. So you log in and say, I want access to this tenant, and then you go use that tenant. The Rackspace implementation, for example, supports multiple tenants when you authenticate. So when you authenticate to Rackspace, you have access to a Swift account called their tenant, and then a cloud servers account that's totally different. And so the API, we left it flexible and tried to keep it as kind of canonical as possible, and that's, I think, caused a lot of confusion when people look at the implementation, because they're looking at Keystone and say, I've got a token and I've got a tenant in there. Why does the API support multiple tenants? And so the idea is to allow operators to expand on that. So we kept only the minimal relationships between the objects. For example, there's actually no inherent relationship between a tenant and a user in the API. It's all in the underlying implementation. So that's an important point, is the API is not the implementation. There are multiple implementations of the API. There's a couple in Rackspace, there's Keystone. I know a couple other big providers that are also writing their own. The other thing, I mentioned that before, is Keystone, we wanted it to be kind of a standard REST interface to support authentication and authorization. Authentication initially, eventually authorization. But we didn't want to kind of take on the whole world of identity management, synchronization, and federate, and all those complex things. So we wanted to try and keep it easy to plug into different backends. Any questions on those 2 points? All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how Keystone works, what it does. The first thing a customer, a client does when they want to use OpenStack is they go in. It's like wanting to go into the building. Put your license, it shows you a picture, your credentials, and you get that badge, and you can go through the building. Token is that badge, right? So the idea is you present your credentials to Keystone one place, you get a token back, and then you go take that token and you can use it everywhere. When we developed that at the time, there were not other standards that we could use that easily that could scale and be RESTful and be cacheable and scale outable. There are some standards out there that are getting close to this. I think SAML, with the idea of a bearer token, which is if you have the token, you get access to the resources, supports something similar. But still, the standards around identity are a little bit tricky. But that's basically what a token is. You know, you pass in your credentials. Username and password is the simplest case. Username and API key is a Rackspace use case as well, and you get a token back, and then you go use that token to use the services. So the token, right now it's just a long string. It could be good, but it could be anything. Right? It could actually say your name and something like that, whatever. If someone has that token, they can do anything they want on anything that token allows. So all you need is the token. This is different than the EC2 API. Someone, so you have to protect your token. You have to be aware of that. Whereas with EC2, there's like secret keys, etc. Make sure that no one can actually go emulate you. So that's why it's more of a bearer token. It's easier to use, right? Curl, put that in there, boom. As opposed to EC2, you probably need some tooling or you need some hashing to do. It's a bit more complex. So it's a balance. So you take that token and then you pass it in to your service. And in Keystone, we had an echo service that was a sample service that basically just responded back with whatever you sent it. And this is the example that we gave of how to integrate your service. If you were Nova or Swift or anybody writing your service, how do you integrate your service into Keystone? So I send in a request to Echo or Nova or whatever, like create server, and I pass in the token. We have middleware that sits there and intercepts that. In most of the OpenStack project, it's just a WSGI filter that looks for that header coming in, and it picks up that token, and then it goes and checks with Keystone. It says, is that a valid token? Right? And then Keystone responds back yes or no. And it comes back with yes, it's a valid token, and returns some information about who that token was issued to. So I'll say, here's the user, tenant, and roles. Right? And then that middleware sends that data down to the service. And so notice at this point that the service still hasn't talked to Keystone at all. So part of what we're trying to do is abstract that away from the service as well. So the service will just receive the data back and can do all the operations without having to talk to Keystone or any different services. And the idea was that we could support multiple protocols here as well, like basic auth, or this could talk directly to LDAP or talk to AD. That was the initial concept that we had.
Does it support expiration? Like, does Keystone ever send to the WSGI layer, hey, you need to expire this token? Or, I mean, I assume there's a timer in there. So the token by default is a 24-hour token that's configurable. In the API doesn't specify that. Mm-hmm. And when the middleware gets back the expiration date of the token, as well as additional information. And there's a number of extensions out there where you can return additional information back as well. And then, so the service gets that information and sends the response back. All right, and so you can use that same token for a number of services. So for Nova, what we did initially was we tried to map the idea of, we had a user a user had multiple roles. Are they an administrator or are they just a regular user? And then the concept of tenant. At the time, Nova had the idea, or actually still has in it, the concept of project. And that's how it collected resources. So you had a bunch of servers that were all under a project. And that's, I think, something that it was inherited from NASA. They have a bunch of projects which they use their cloud for. So tenant was the more generic concept. We mapped the two. So project in Nova is the same as tenant in Keystone. And we initially did one role, which was just the admin role. In Swift, they have the concept of account. So you create an account. Under account, you have multiple containers, and then you throw objects in the containers. So we mapped tenant to account. And Swift had already proxy layers and a number of WSGI components in there. Right. So, like high level again, the user sends in credentials, gets a token back, and that's what they use to go forward and do all their work in the cloud. Right. So you authenticate once. You send the token in. The middleware goes and checks the token, gets the data back. So the middleware, the call only has the token in it, but the service needs to know a whole bunch of information about you. That's what the middleware goes, gets that information. This is usually done over a secure network as well. And that data gets sent back to the service, and it gets sent back out. How does Keystone know that the credentials are valid? And so we had two implementations originally. We did SQLite, where you store usernames and passwords, and then we had an LDAP backend. That was written by Mirantis as well, so you could tie that back into LDAP. And the intent was we were going to add, Active Directory, PAM, all these different services. But once Keystone was in OpenStack, we just listened to the community on what they wanted next. And so those items were not, like stability was what they wanted next, so we focused on that. So those are still on the roadmap. I think the latest merge of Keystone includes a PAM backend. We've done some Active Directory work, but we haven't merged that in yet. So we'll put that in there soon. So you'll be able to have Keystone talk to a number of these backends. So this username and password could be your PAM username and password if you've got this all set up on one machine as a developer. Or it could be your Active Directory username and password if you want to send that back out.
Which of those are going to be in Essex?
Essex, SQL Alchemy, which is we test with SQLite. We don't guarantee, but we often will spin up servers and test with Postgres and MySQL, and then the LDAP backend. Yeah. So no, we haven't dove into AD much. I know a number of people are working on it. I don't know how far they've got. I don't know if it works well for them.
I thought I heard somewhere that maybe in the Folsom release you had on the Nova and Swift slides, you showed how the mappings of user tenant roles had different names. They were going to rename those within those projects to map the Keystone. Is that something, or is that my imagination?
A lot of that is going to have to be discussed at Folsom to figure out. So in the Boston Summit, Diablo, last September, what we heard was we wanted stability and RBAC, so role-based access control. And those were the two biggest things we ever said, okay, that's what we actually put down as what we're going to deliver. But while we were working on stability, I think that's when the direction was like, let's just rebuild this and make it more Pythonic. And so that's taken up most of Essex. So as it stands, from what we heard from people, RBAC is still pretty important. I think it's reasonable to expect that we can deliver RBAC and probably a couple more backends like Active Directory in the Folsom timeframe. But we'll have to put these out there at the next summit and see what people are looking for. But you don't have to wait for the summit. If somebody cares cares a lot about something, you want to vote for it, let us know, shoot us an email, submit a patch. That's about it.
Particularly submit a patch.
Yeah. So again, the idea is that's any service can do that. We talked about the idea of supporting multiple protocols. So this could be basic auth that talks to PAM, so it doesn't even talk to Keystone. And so that was part of what we're trying to do is build this in a way such that it was flexible in the components. So we defined kind of this API. Here's the headers you get back from the middleware. We defined the auth API, one RESTful API, which was scalable, and we try to do that in a way such that the implementation was independent of that. So I know there's a number of providers out there that are writing their own implementations, which use different protocols, following that same standard. So in Keystone, actually, there was also, we had a basic auth component in there, so you could actually make a call with basic auth. I haven't tested that in a while. There's been a lot of changes, so I don't know if it still works, but it's in the code base. We also wanted it to be, again, like the topology. We tried to keep the topology as flexible as possible. So you could have the auth component. It can reject calls. There's also the opportunity to say delegate the rejection, which means even if I don't authenticate, I can still send the request down to the service to make the final decision. That works for things like in Swift if you have a public object and you don't care if people authenticate it. Swift makes the final decision. Even if it's unauthenticated, I'm still going to serve it. So you have that option there. So we send, these are some of the headers that we send down. They're all documented on keystone.openstack.org. Anything that sends those headers in should work with the underlying service, as long as the headers are sent in correctly. All right, so the idea was that it was agnostic of whatever protocol you're using. So this is where you can get for in-depth information on Keystone, keystone.openstack.org. If you want to see the code, the blueprints, what's happening out there, launchpad.net. The wiki has a lot of information, and you can email me directly if you have any questions.
Any questions additionally for Ziad?
Yeah, so we tried to set this up with Burrow, right? Burrow requires Keystone to be functional. I think that's the consensus, right? I wasn't sure. Is it safe to run the trunk of Keystone against a stable Diablo? Is that a
trunk of Keystone with stable Diablo? It should be yes.
Yeah.
It should be yes.
Yeah, is there a way to take a Nova credentials and somehow import them into Keystone?
There is a Keystone import command.
Okay.
That was written by Paul Vocio. It's in the Keystone code base. So under bin in Keystone.
Okay.
That should give you a way to import commands in there.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. All right. So basically, right now there isn't really a problem with you don't have to pick. I know there was a Keystone release for Diablo, but this pack stable, but I think it's very not stable. So it's fine to run it on trunk and it should work, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Since Diablo, one thing that we did to kind of address the need for stability is we started gating all reviews with a DevStack integrated test. So not only do you have to pass your own tests, then a DevStack VM is spun up. All the systems are connected in there: dashboard, Keystone, Swift, class, etc. And they're all built, and a bunch of exercise tests are run in there.
Yeah.
And so if any of the middleware breaks anything, that gets out there. So that's to address some of those challenges with the instability.
Cool.
We also have a number of CI projects. OpenStack CI and Tempest, I think, are two. Which are trying to address that. Yes, during Diablo, it was a challenge to keep everything in sync.
Cool, thank you.
I'm curious how you do with groups. So like if lots of users are supposed to fold up into one, PO, one billing, I'll say bunch of different companies are supposed to be in one billing.
Yeah. Groups was a hotly debated topic because people expect different functionality around groups. and it was frankly a challenge to try and get everybody to agree on what a group is, and so we just left it out for now. So we don't have groups. HP has put in a proposal for the concept of domains, where you can have different domains that are basically the administration domains. So I can then carve up Keystone. I get my own domain, and I can manage users in there. Right now, Keystone is kind of flat. If I have admin rights, I can manage users everywhere. Rackspace put out extensions for groups as well. We put up the API extensions, but we didn't do the implementation. We actually took them back out right now. So groups is another open topic about how do we want to implement that. I think the challenge with groups, again, like what we did was with the API is we have the idea we have a flat list of tenants, which is a grouping of resources, flat list of users that have credentials that can go get a token, and then the mapping between them is very, very, very loose. The more you start to add structures of a regular identity management solution, like groups, that relationship starts to get more complex. We left it very decoupled and loose so that on the back end, you can tie into a lot of different systems. So you tie into AD, you tie into MySQL, you tie into different systems. The mappings can generally be worked out. When you start to put groups in there, it gets more complex to do that mapping back in there. So I think that's going to be a challenge of how to do that. My view is we should try and keep it as decoupled as possible. The idea is you create groups and they're totally independent, and then you have a way to map users to groups and keep it as simple as light as possible. Occam's razor, only the relationships you need.
So then you have to do a lot of the same thing in all of the tenants, right? Maybe I don't understand what you're proposing there, but I mean, you have to do all the group logic in every single tenant.
It has to be done somewhere. Maybe an Active Directory, right?
Yeah. It's following the concept of separation of concerns. Tenant, the idea of tenant is it's a grouping of resources, right? So it's just you put servers in there, you put containers, you put networks like in Quantum, and then you just group them one way. There's no additional semantic to that. Doesn't mean tenant is one customer, tenant is one client. You might have, there might be that I use one tenant for my webheads, another tenant for my database backends. I manage them separately under one account. Like it's completely flexible that way. So we try to remove as much logic there. So tenant is just a grouping of resources. So if you define group as just a grouping of users, you can create just a flat list of groups and have users to that. That might be one way to do that. Then the question is, what does a group do? What are you trying to achieve with a group? Do you want to be able to basically grant a group access to a number of tenants and then add and remove users in there? That might be a use case. You put that out there and see how what the comments are, what people's takes are, what are conflicting use cases.
But as soon as you define what those semantics are, it's going to map well to one back end like Active Directory, but not map well to some other back end, and then you're kind of playing favorites.
Here's another example. For example, rate limits. So you might have different groups of people that have different classes of service that get different type of rate limits. And so that case has really nothing to do with tenants. It's just going to be somewhere on the file on the API. So that's something we do at Rackspace. And so really, it's the challenge is going to be to talk about what are the use cases that you're trying to fit with that use with groups.
If he has feedback on this, where do we send the feedback? Is there a chat?
If you want a one-on-one debate, I'll be happy to engage. Mailing list is a great place to if you have a need, you want to put it out there. If you know exactly what you want, you want to talk about the implementation, you could put a blueprint out there and on Launchpad and say, look, here's the use case we want, and here's how we'd like it to implement it. And then follow up with a notification on the mailing list. The mailing list is the best place to kind of start a debate because everybody monitors that.
And what mailing list exactly? Is there a Keystone mailing list separate from the?
No, we were using the regular OpenStack, the main mailing list. Yeah, and the main IRC channel as well.
And there's weekly IRC meetings.
There's weekly IRC meetings, so you can look for the Keystone meetings.
So there's been some debate on this already. If I were to check out the alternatives, there's some talk about groups already.
There has been some talk about groups. I don't know how much of it was public.
Oh, okay.
The public stance, when we talked about incubating Keystone, it was a challenge to get people to adopt it. So the public stance we took from the beginning was like, we're going to do as minimum as possible just to get an identity project in there,
right.
And then we'll evolve from there. So we said, can we do it without groups? We said yes. All right. So anytime groups came up, we're like, nope.
Next time.
And the weekly meetings are archived as well. The IRC ones are archived.
That's right. Yeah. That's for all the projects. So the IRCs are available. I don't think groups have come up in the Keystone IRC meetings. But probably.
Yeah, it's more day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
And very brief, what are the big features planned for post assets?
We didn't have anything planned for post assets. We had talked about federation. So the idea of federation was 2 Keystone installs talking to each other, so that you can start to do bursting into one cloud or the other. Given that RBAC is pushed into the Folsom timeframe, I don't know if federation is going to be able to make it in there. I know it's an important use case for cloud in general. I know Rackspace cares about that. So we'll have to see what kind of resources we can fit in and when we can do it. It's a complex thing. You can do it with SAML, but SAML might be, again, the conversation is going to be, is SAML what we want to use? It's a standard, it's out there, it allows interoperability, but then it's complex.
I would argue there's Dell guys in the room and HP guys in the room and so forth. Cloud bursting is so central to all of our arguments to our customers. So if you have any resources laying around that you aren't using and you could throw them at Keystone, that would be really important to get that cloud bursting stuff in. Those spare cloud developers that we have no use for.
Yeah, so federation, for the cloud bursting use case, we've been looking at, there's 3 things that can be called federation that need to happen. One is you need to get the systems to talk to each other. You need to have like a secure network. That's network federation is basically a VPN. And they need to have some kind of identity federation, so that my identity is known across the bursting pipe or wherever it is. And then the third one, which you brought up, is accounting federation. So how does my use into a burst get back into my account? So how does usage make it back? And so those are the 3 areas we're talking about which need to be addressed. So Keystone tackles one of them, which is going to be identity federation. Quantum, I think, is going to have to tackle the network federation, cloud pipe or something like that. And the accounting federation, that I don't think has been touched yet.
But we'd be happy to talk to anyone who wants to about it.
Ziad, some of the new, I know some of the new news that came out about Keystone Light. How's the reception been? Have you been hearing some feedback that you've been hearing outside of the press group?
The feedback was positive about the move to the Keystone Light architecture. The architecture was very good. We took some of that architecture and put it into SX2 and SX3 of the Keystone master branch. It just merged in yesterday, so I haven't heard feedback. Part of the challenge with Keystone and with a lot of these projects is contract first, API design, and then implementation, versus evolving the implementation, letting the API come out of that. And I think there's different communities and different perspectives on that. I don't think there's a right or wrong. It just depends on what you're trying to do. And so part of the challenge is because I work with a lot of large systems in Rackspace and I deal with integration, I lean towards contract first because it's just almost intractable to try and do that for large integrations, to try and not do that for large integrations. But I also have to respect the community where you have a lot of agile, young teams, small teams that are just trying to evolve really fast. And OpenStack is actually evolving really fast, so you don't want to slow that down. So it's actually been a constant tension to manage. How strict do we maintain the API versus how much do we allow it to change? And it's just been, I think it's a good tension to have to constantly manage that. You go too loose, you end up with what happened in Diablo, right? Where the API is changing all the time and you can't integrate. You go that's been one of the challenges.
I think that's going to happen more and more in OpenStack. As when you see some company like AT&T, well, that's a telco. There's one thing telcos know how to do, it's bill, right? And so every second you're on the phone, they're up in your bill. So they got a really robust billing architecture. The idea that we're going to define some billing architecture, you know, at Rackspace and impose it on AT&T, that's a non-starter. So that's going to have to be some high-level API contract that they can implement their way, and we can implement on our way, and so on. I just don't see that evolving from the ground up because they already got one. Right? And a lot of the services we're talking about throwing into OpenStack over the course of time are going to be like that. So I don't know how to solve that problem. On a refactoring Friday, you can't just casually refactor the API. You can't do it.
Yeah, so the Keystone Lite merge was in yesterday. I think some of the XML contracts are not 100% in line with the spec. The JSON, I haven't done a full comparison, so there's slight discrepancies, but there might be things that nobody's touched yet, so nobody's going to break. But so I'm waiting to hear the feedback. Hopefully.
So download Essex, the latest version of Essex.
Yeah, download Trunk and try it out.
Some feedback.
Does work with DevStack, so it does work with the other projects. Again, Trunk is tested with everything that we push in, so you get that compatibility. But if you have any tools that integrate Chef, for example, you might want to try and test that out, and so that we have a chance to fix it before S6.
Is this live on? I don't know if it's live yet. TriStack is up yet, but if it is this available via TriStack?
TriStack's running Diablo standard.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, the stuff I was demoing earlier is hitting the V2 Keystone API to get the token, and then it hits the V11 Cloud API or Compute API.
Yeah. And the V2 API has been unchanged since Diablo. There were a couple of implementation misses that were in the Diablo stable code base, which is what somebody was referring to. We had to backport a couple of patches to that. But the core stuff in terms of validation and authentication was the same. Has not changed.
And API OpenStack org went up today as well, so you can see those APIs and the JSON XML that they take, in case you missed that.
Cool. That's right. Yeah, no, that's a very cool site.
API.openstack.org.
Yeah.
API.openstack.org. Yeah. So you can like drop down JSON XML and you can see that. I'd love to at some point see samples, curl, how to actually call the APIs and just what they return. So I'll be advocating for that.
In your opinion, is the Keystone Lite equal to Keystone, just re-architected? Or is there any new features or new things in Keystone Lite or Redux branch that are going to merge back in?
In my opinion, it's better architected, much cleaner code, probably much more enjoyable to work with, but it doesn't have the maturity of the master branch. And I think that's going to be the challenge for our team, is to get it as mature as where Keystone is, because all that challenge we went through with Diablo, and then the last two releases where we didn't do many features, just stabilizing it, has resulted in a pretty mature code base. And so we haven't changed much APIs in E1, E2, or E3. So it's just a little bit of catch up there. But given that it's better architected and easier to work with, it should allow us to move faster towards stability in Essex, and then beyond that to move faster to get Federation and R back in there.
But it's not forgetting to drop in our case with Keystone Essex. You have private plans of merging them together at some point. Keystone Lite.
They are merged. Trunk Keystone today is actually Keystone Lite.
Okay.
So if Trunk today versus Trunk 3 days ago, significant, huge change.
But not at the API level.
Not at the API level. That's right.
There's a testament to the ability to re-implement APIs without breaking.
Exactly. So it's drag and drop. I think there's migration code in there. So if you have your database with a Keystone master in there, you should be able to run a migration command that ports that into the current trunk as well, so that when Essex comes out, with the Keystone-like code, you have a clean migration path as well.
Any other questions? Great, thank you.